There is something about the British royal family that the rest of the world simply cannot look away from. It is not just the drama, though there has certainly been plenty of that in recent years. It is not just the scandals, the divorces, the fallouts, the headlines that seem to never stop coming. It is something older than all of that, something deeper. It is the traditions, the rituals, the ceremonies that have been performed in almost exactly the same way for hundreds of years, that connect the present to the past in a way that very few things in the modern world still can. In an age where everything changes constantly, where technology reshapes daily life almost overnight, and institutions rise and fall at dizzying speed, the British monarchy sits there, dressed in velvet and gold, doing things in 2026 that it was doing in the 1600s, and the world watches fascinated, sometimes baffled, occasionally amused, but always watching. But here is the thing that most people miss when they look at all of that pageantry and tradition. Most people see it as a kind of living museum, a snapshot of history frozen in time, a performance put on for tourists and cameras. And on the surface, that is understandable. When you see a guardsman standing completely motionless outside a palace, dressed in a bearskin hat so tall, it seems almost comically impractical, not blinking, not moving, as hundreds of tourists snap photographs and small children wave in his face. It is easy to dismiss the whole thing as theater. When you read that the British monarch technically owns all unmarked swans in the open waters of England and Wales, and that every July a team of people rows up the River Thames specifically to count them, you might wonder whether someone somewhere is having a very elaborate joke at the world's expense. But the truth is far more interesting than the caricature. These traditions, strange as they may appear on the surface, tell a story about a nation, about power, about identity, and about the endlessly complicated relationship between the past and the present. And that story is changing right now in ways that are genuinely historic. Let's start with the tradition that most people think they know, because it is the most visible, the most photographed, the most instantly recognizable piece of royal pageantry in the world: the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. Every day, at a time that varies by season, the soldiers currently guarding the palace are relieved by a fresh detachment. They march in formation, accompanied by a band, dressed in their famous red tunics and black bearskin hats, performing a ceremony that has been carried out with the same deliberate precision since the palace became the monarch's London residence. It draws enormous crowds every single time it happens. Tourists queue for hours to get a good view. And yet most of those tourists, and honestly most British people, could not tell you what this ceremony is actually about, what it means, where it comes from, or why those hats are quite that tall. The ceremony dates back centuries and is rooted in the entirely practical military need to transfer responsibility for guarding the sovereign from one unit to another. The formality, the precision, the music, the elaborate marching formations, all of that was not designed to entertain tourists. It was designed to communicate something to anyone watching, friend and potential enemy alike, that the monarch was protected by a disciplined, organized, and formidable military force. The bearskin hats, incidentally, date back to the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, when the Foot Guards defeated Napoleon's elite Imperial Guard, who wore those distinctive tall fur hats. The British adopted the style as a trophy, a visible reminder of that victory. And more than 200 years later, those same hats are still worn, still standing in front of the same palace, still stopping traffic and sending cameras clicking. That is a rather astonishing through line of history when you think about it. Then there are the ravens at the Tower of London. And honestly, if you were going to invent a piece of royal tradition designed to be memorable and just slightly unsettling, you would be hard-pressed to do better than this. According to legend, if the 6 ravens that are permanently kept at the Tower of London ever leave or fly away, both the tower and the kingdom itself will fall into ruin. The story is usually traced back to King Charles II in the 17th century, whose royal astronomer, a man named John Flamsteed, complained bitterly that the ravens at the tower were interfering with his observatory work. The king reportedly ordered the ravens to be killed, but was warned by a courtier that doing so would bring catastrophe upon the crown. Heeding that warning, Charles not only kept the ravens, but decreed that at least 6 must be maintained at the tower at all times. The tradition has survived every crisis since, including the Second World War, when the raven population fell to just 1 remaining bird. Officials scrambled to restore the numbers immediately after the war ended, because nobody, not even in the midst of modern warfare, was willing to be the person who let the kingdom fall because they ran short of ravens. Today, the tower maintains 7 ravens, that extra one serving as a kind of insurance policy against the prophecy. They each have names. In recent years, those names have included Harris, Jubilee, Poppy, Edgar, Georgie, Chaos, Henry, and Poe. They have individual personalities, quirks, and reputations. There is a dedicated yeoman warder called the Raven Master, whose entire role within the tower is to care for these birds, feed them, manage their health, and maintain the tradition of their presence. The ravens are fed twice a day on a diet that includes raw meat, mice, chicks, and occasionally biscuits soaked in blood. They are, by any objective measure, very well looked after. Some of them have also, at various points, been deeply misbehaved. One raven named George was formally dismissed from his post, sacked from the Tower of London, because he would not stop eating television aerials. Another named Grog was last reliably spotted outside an East End pub, which honestly sounds like the beginning of a joke, but is completely true. The Raven Master does occasionally trim the ravens' flight feathers to encourage them to stay put, a practical measure that does slightly undercut the mystical grandeur of the whole arrangement, but which does at least mean that the kingdom is protected from the inconvenience of a raven that has decided it would rather live elsewhere. What is particularly fascinating about the raven tradition, and what historians of royal pageantry find especially interesting, is that the story may not be nearly as ancient as it claims to be. Some scholars argue that the ravens at the tower are an example of what academics call an invented tradition, a custom designed to appear ancient, but actually constructed or significantly embellished in the Victorian era, when there was an enormous appetite for rituals that linked modern Britain to a romantic, legendary past. The Victorian age produced a great number of these apparently timeless traditions, many of which the British public now accepts as having existed since time immemorial. Whether the Raven legend is a genuine 17th century royal decree or a clever piece of Victorian mythology building is almost beside the point. The legend exists, the ravens exist, the Raven Master exists, and the Tower of London attracts over 3 million visitors a year, many of whom come specifically to see those birds. The story, true or invented, does exactly what royal tradition is supposed to do. It makes people feel connected to something larger than themselves, something ancient and enduring and just slightly magical. Now let us talk about swans, because you cannot talk honestly about British royal traditions without talking about swans, and the story is every bit as wonderfully peculiar as you might hope. Since the 12th century, the British monarch has held the right to claim ownership of all unmarked mute swans swimming in open waters throughout England and Wales. This right dates back to a time when swans were an extremely prized food served at royal banquets and aristocratic feasts, and the monarch's claim to them was a demonstration of sovereign power over the natural resources of the kingdom. Today, of course, swans are a protected species. Nobody in the royal household is eating swan, The idea of King Charles sitting down to a swan dinner is both historically anachronistic and, one imagines, deeply unappealing to the king himself, given his well-documented commitment to environmental conservation. But the tradition persists because in Britain, traditions rarely disappear simply because the original reason for them has evaporated. Every July, a team of royal swan uppers, dressed in the official scarlet of the royal household, sets off in traditional rowing skiffs to travel along a specific stretch of the River Thames. Over 5 days, they count, weigh, and assess the health of the mute swans they find, checking for injuries and monitoring the overall welfare of the population. The ceremony is officially presided over by the King's Swan Marker, a position that has existed in the royal household since the 12th century, making it one of the oldest ongoing official roles in British public life. There is also a Warden of the Swans, representing the Vintners Company, one of the ancient City of London guilds, who also has rights over a portion of the swan population, a complication that adds a further layer of medieval complexity to what is, at its heart, a bird census. Queen Elizabeth II attended swan upping for the first time in 2009, making it the first time in centuries that a monarch had personally witnessed a ceremony carried out in their name. When she arrived on the riverbank and watched the swan uppers at work, one newspaper described it as a queen meeting one of her oldest prerogatives face to face for the first time. The king now carries that same ancient right, walking into the future with a 1,000-year-old responsibility for the swans of England attached to his crown. Then there is the ceremony of the keys at the Tower of London, which is almost certainly the world's oldest continuously performed military ceremony. Every single night, without exception, at precisely 9:53 in the evening, the chief yeoman warder of the tower emerges from the byward tower carrying the keys to the fortress, accompanied by an escort of soldiers. They make their way through the tower, locking each gate in sequence. When they approach the bloody tower, a sentry steps forward and challenges them. The exchange that follows is identical every night, word for word, and has been for at least 700 years. The chief warder declares that he carries the king's keys. The sentry commands him to pass. The keys are delivered to the resident governor of the tower for safekeeping, and the ceremony ends as it always ends, at 10 o'clock exactly, with the bugler sounding the last post. This ceremony has happened every night without fail, through plagues, through wars, through the bombing of London in the Second World War. On that occasion, an explosion from a German airstrike knocked the chief warder and his escort clean off their feet. They picked themselves up, dusted themselves off, and completed the ceremony. The chief warder later sent a formal letter of apology to King George VI, noting that the ceremony had concluded several minutes late due to enemy action. The king responded that under the circumstances this was entirely acceptable. It is the kind of story that sounds apocryphal but is completely documented, and it captures something essential about what royal tradition means to the people who carry it out. It is not theater for its own sake. It is a commitment, a form of faith that the thing continues regardless of what the world throws at it. And then there are the traditions that have quietly, almost invisibly, changed or disappeared in recent years, which is perhaps the most interesting part of the whole story when you are trying to understand what the royal family actually looks like today rather than what it looked like in textbooks. Because one of the great misunderstandings about royal tradition is the assumption that these things are fixed, permanent, and unchangeable. In fact, the history of the monarchy is also a history of constant, usually quiet, adaptation. Rules and customs that seem eternal are discarded when they become untenable. New practices emerge and are gradually dressed up in the language of ancient precedent. The institution survives not because it refuses to change, but because it changes just slowly enough that the changes are rarely visible until you look back over a long span of time. Take the role of ladies-in-waiting. For centuries, royal women were attended by ladies-in-waiting, aristocratic companions who served almost every personal function, writing letters on the royal's behalf, managing wardrobes and servants, accompanying their mistress everywhere, filling the hours of royal life with company and assistance. Queen Elizabeth II maintained this tradition throughout her long reign, employing ladies-in-waiting in a recognizably traditional capacity. But when Camilla became Queen Consort after King Charles III's coronation in 2023, she quietly did away with the title of Lady-in-Waiting altogether. Instead, she appointed companions, women who fill some of the same functions, but without the feudal overtones of the traditional title. It is a small change, barely noticed by most people, but it is the kind of change that tells you something about how the institution sees itself and how it wants to be seen. Or consider the tradition of royal secrecy around finances. For generations, the finances of the British monarchy were treated as a matter entirely beyond public scrutiny. The monarch paid no income tax and had no obligation whatsoever to disclose their financial affairs. Queen Elizabeth II quietly began paying voluntary income tax in 1993, following public pressure in the aftermath of a period of considerable royal scandal. But even then, the details remained private. No numbers were published. No accounts were opened to public view. The royal family operated, financially speaking, in a kind of sovereign twilight, beyond the reach of the transparency that was increasingly expected of every other major institution in British public life. That is now changing, and it is changing in a way that is genuinely historic. In June of 2026, Buckingham Palace announced that King Charles III would become the first British monarch in history to publicly disclose his personal tax bill. The decision, the palace was clear, came at the express wish of the king himself. He would be publishing how much tax he had paid in the fiscal year 2024 to 2025, covering his income from the Duchy of Lancaster, from private investments, and from his estates at Sandringham and Balmoral. Palace officials described it as part of an ongoing effort to modernize royal finances and boost transparency, particularly in the context of intense public scrutiny following the scandal surrounding Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and questions about how royal funds had been managed and allocated. This is not a small thing. This is a fundamental shift in the relationship between the crown and the concept of accountability, and it is happening right now, in real time. The tradition of the balcony appearance at Buckingham Palace during Trooping the Colour is another place where the visible shape of royal tradition is quietly but unmistakably changing. For decades under Queen Elizabeth, the balcony scene on the day of the monarch's official birthday parade was a carefully orchestrated tableau of royal abundance. Extended family members, cousins, and minor royals and royal children of every generation all gathered together to wave at the crowd and watch the Royal Air Force fly past. It was warm, slightly chaotic, and created the impression of a close and cheerful royal family unit celebrating together. By Trooping the Colour 2026, that balcony looked very different. The image was notably tighter, the group was smaller. The Yorks were absent, following Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's arrest and the ongoing legal shadow over that branch of the family. The Sussexes were absent, as they have been since Prince Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties and relocated to California. What remained was what royal commentators have taken to calling the slimmed-down monarchy, a tighter, more deliberately curated group centered on the king, Queen Camilla, Prince William, Princess Catherine, and their children. The three children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, were there, smiling and waving, and the cameras found them easily because the usual visual crowd around them had thinned considerably. Prince William, who will one day inherit the crown, is said to have strong views about the shape of the monarchy he intends to lead. Reports suggest he envisions what might be described as a corporate-style restructuring of the institution, focused on financial transparency, social impact, and the stripping away of what he considers outdated forms. His alleged proposals include removing titles from non-working royals, enforcing stricter rules about the use of royal residences, cutting the palace staff significantly, and reducing the number of public engagements in favor of fewer but more meaningful commitments. Whether all of these ambitions translate into actual changes when he eventually takes the throne remains to be seen. But the direction of travel is clear. The monarchy that William intends to lead will look different from the one he inherited, and the traditions it maintains will be the ones that serve a clear and defensible purpose in the 21st century. It is worth pausing here and asking what purpose royal traditions actually serve, because this is the question that often gets lost in the noise of either uncritical reverence or reflexive Republican dismissal. The easy answer is that they serve tourism. Britain's royal ceremonies and landmarks are a colossal economic draw. Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, Windsor Castle, the changing of the guard, all of it generates enormous amounts of money from international visitors who come specifically to experience something they cannot find anywhere else. That is real and it matters. But it is not the deepest answer. The deeper answer has to do with identity and continuity, with the human need for rituals that connect us to something larger than our individual lives and our immediate moment in history. When the chief yeoman warder locks the gates of the Tower of London at 9 on a Tuesday evening in June 2026, repeating words that have been spoken in the same place at the same time for 700 years, something happens that is genuinely hard to replicate in any other context. The present reaches back and touches the past. The person performing the ritual becomes, for those few minutes, part of a chain of humans stretching back through centuries of British history, through world wars and plagues and revolutions, and the deaths of kings and the crowning of queens. There is a dignity in that, a weight of meaning that mere efficiency cannot produce, and that no amount of modern management theory can manufacture from scratch. This is why the monarchy, even in times of considerable scandal and criticism, retains a connection to the British public that purely rational analysis sometimes struggles to explain. And yet the traditions must evolve, because traditions that cannot adapt eventually become hollow, and hollowness is more dangerous to an institution than honest change. The monarchy has survived this long not by refusing to change, but by changing in the right ways at the right times, usually under pressure, but sometimes by design. The decision of Queen Elizabeth II to appear on television and address the nation after the death of Princess Diana in 1997, breaking with a deeply ingrained tradition of royal silence on personal matters, was one such moment. The decision to hold Diana's funeral as a semi-public event, to let the cameras in, to acknowledge the grief of a nation, was another. The slow acceptance of divorce among senior royals, the gradual opening up of the palace to television cameras and social media, the movement of royal births from formal announcements on hand-signed notes displayed on golden easels to simultaneous posts on Instagram, all of these are moments where the tradition bends rather than breaks, and the institution survives. The baptism traditions are another fascinating window into how the old and the new sit side by side within the royal family. Royal children are still baptized with water brought from the river Jordan, the same river where, according to Scripture, Jesus himself was baptized by John the Baptist. That tradition is centuries old and shows no sign of disappearing. But the announcement of a royal birth, which was for generations made by a formal notice placed on a ceremonial easel outside Buckingham Palace, handwritten at first and later typed, now happens simultaneously through official social media channels, because the palace learned long ago that the world finds out from Twitter before it finds out from an easel, and it is better to control that narrative than to be overtaken by it. The tradition of the monarch having two birthdays is another one that baffles people encountering it for the first time. King Charles was born on the 14th of November, which is well into the British autumn. His official birthday, the one marked by trooping the color and the gun salutes and all the public ceremony, is held in June. This is not a recent eccentricity. It goes back generations, rooted in the practical reality that British summer weather, while not exactly guaranteed to be glorious, is at least more reliable than November, and that outdoor military parades require something resembling decent conditions. The tradition of holding the official birthday celebration in summer began with King George II in the 18th century, and it has continued ever since, even now, when it is somewhat more possible to predict the weather and entirely possible to hold military parades indoors. The tradition continues not because it is necessary, but because it is the tradition, and that, in the world of royal custom, is a perfectly sufficient reason. Every year on the 18th of June, a member of the family that has been Dukes of Wellington since 1815 travels to Windsor Castle and presents the crown with a small silk flag embroidered with the French tricolor. This is the annual rent paid for Stratfield Sayre House in Hampshire, the estate given by a grateful nation to the first Duke of Wellington after his victory over Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. The current Duke pays this rent every year on the anniversary of that battle, handing over a French battle standard as a symbolic acknowledgement that the house and its grounds belong to the crown. The monarch accepts the flag, which is then hung in the guard chamber at Windsor Castle over a bust of the original Duke, a rent payment made in silk and ceremony for a house given over 2 centuries ago. Royal tradition at its most characteristically British. What makes all of this so compelling to observe in 2026, in the middle of what is arguably the most turbulent period for the British monarchy in living memory, is the contrast between the ancient and unchanging rituals on one hand and the urgent contemporary pressure for reform and transparency on the other. The same institution that maintains ravens at the Tower and counts swans on the Thames and dresses its guards in 200-year-old battlefield trophies is also, right now, publishing its tax returns for the first time in history. It is simultaneously the most traditional and the most scrutinized it has ever been. It is being asked to justify its existence in terms that the modern world finds legible, to demonstrate that it earns the loyalty and the public funding it receives, while also continuing to perform the ancient ceremonies that make it what it is. King Charles III is navigating this tension with what observers describe as a kind of quiet determination. He is a man who has spent his entire life preparing for a role that finally came to him in his 70s, and he brings to it both a deep reverence for its traditions and a genuine belief that those traditions must serve a living purpose. His commitment to environmental causes, his founding of the Sustainable Markets Initiative, his engagement with global business leaders around questions of climate and conservation, these are not standard monarch activities. They are the activities of a man who decided long ago that a crown carries with it a responsibility to do something useful with the platform it provides, not just to embody and maintain the rituals of the past. And yet he also led the Order of the Garter ceremony at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle in June 2026, presiding over one of the oldest chivalric traditions in the world in exactly the way it has been presided over for centuries, because he understands that these rituals are not in conflict with a modern purpose. They are, in fact, part of what makes the modern purpose possible. The truth about royal traditions today, then, is that they are neither the pure living museum that cynics like to dismiss, nor the unchanged ancient wisdom that romantics like to celebrate. They are something more interesting than both of those things. They are a conversation between past and present, conducted through ceremony and symbol, and occasionally through ravens with attitude problems and 700-year-old gate-locking rituals. They are proof that human beings need stories, need ritual, need connection to something that outlasts any one individual life. And they are, right now, in the process of being renegotiated in real time. As a new king, a future king, and a public that is asking harder questions than ever before, work out together what this ancient institution is for, what it owes to those who support it, and which of its traditions deserve to survive into the century ahead. Some will survive unchanged. The ceremony of the keys will be performed tonight, just as it was performed last night, just as it was performed in the 14th century, because some things are too deeply woven into the fabric of a place and a people to be unpicked without losing something essential. Some will adapt quietly, as the role of ladies-in-waiting adapted into the role of royal companions, as the announcement of royal births adapted from handwritten notes on golden easels to Instagram posts, and some will be let go as the tradition of non-disclosure of royal finances is now being let go, because the cost of maintaining them has become greater than the cost of change. That is the truth about royal traditions today. They are alive, they are contested, they are beautiful and sometimes baffling and occasionally absurd, and they are, in their strange and enduring way, one of the most fascinating windows into what it means to try to hold the past and the present together in the same pair of hands.